Jacquelyn received her doctorate from Johns Hopkins University and comes to us most directly from the Near Eastern Studies Department at UC Berkeley, where she has been a faculty fellow. But what's really interesting about her is her DIRT experience. I just learned that term. She is director of the expedition to Tel El Armana for the Egypt Exploration Society. She's project director of the reclamation of the I can't even say it.
Program of the Komolnana Sunshade of Nefertiti project from 2005 to present.
That's exactly what I meant, as well as many others. And we will leave it as that because I know you are eager to hear about the lost temple of Nefertiti. Jacquelyn.
Thanks very much, everybody, for showing up today. I'm going to review my talk. I'll begin by reviewing the historical context of Nefertiti's reign, and then turn to an examination of Egyptian queenship in general and Nefertiti specifically. This will in turn set up my discussion on the discoveries I've made regarding what I believe to be her Sunshade of Re temple, a structure that was mentioned on the foundation texts of Akhenaten city at Tel El Amarna, but which had not actually been found archaeologically. I'll then turn to an interpretation of some of the evidence from the site, which I believe to be, as I said, her Sunshade of Re temple. Akhenaten reigned for approximately 17 years, depending on which scholar you're talking to. This is from approximately 1353 to 1336 BC, which begins in the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom. This is one of the most prosperous time periods in ancient Egyptian history. The vast Egyptian empire in this era stretched down to the Sudan in the south and up to the northern reaches of Syria. The wealth of this empire was at its zenith under Amenhotep III, who is the father of Akhenaten. This period of economic stability allowed Amenhotep III, who again the father of Akhenaten, to initiate great building plans throughout the country. Throughout Egyptian history, core institutions such as temples were endowed by the king with lands and material goods, which the temples in turn redistributed to the population. As well as being economic engines, temples were not simply houses for deities, but were also microcosms of Egyptian cosmogony. The proper functioning of these temples guaranteed the continuance of prosperity for the entire kingdom. Moreover, temple art provided mechanisms for the king and the elite to assert their ideology and power to the illiterate, who of course at this stage made up approximately 90 to 95% of the population. So art was not simply decoration, but rather it can be understood as artifact. Because to make art or architecture was to give order to the world. And for this reason, archaeology is often better at communicating the politics of a pharaoh's reign than of pharaoh's official texts. So that's why this talk is very picture heavy. Amenhotep III instituted many changes during his reign. Although these were moderate changes, they were notable for a society that had thrived on uniformity and tradition. The Egyptians had always venerated the sun god Re, who also is sometimes called Ra. However, Amenhotep III paid unusually marked attention to Re. In year 30 of his reign, he changed his own long list of names and titles to include the name Aten. In its form as the visible sun disk in the daytime sky, the Aten was hailed as the actual image of the god Re, and Amenhotep III again paid unusually marked attention to the Aten, a previously relatively marginal deity. Amenhotep III had several children with his wife, Queen T. The eldest son, Tutmosis, predeceased his father. The youngest, named Amenhotep IV, named after his father, became the heir apparent. A few years after the death of Amenhotep III and his assumption of the throne, Amenhotep IV, whose name means Amun is satisfied, changed his name to Akhenaten, which means one who is effective for the Aten. During the first year of his reign, Akhenaten, who was still called Amenhotep IV, completed the monuments his father had begun, including parts of the temple to Amun at Karnak. According to inscriptions on these structures, he was married to Nefertiti approximately around year 4. As none of her own titles indicate a royal lineage, we can only assume that Nefertiti was the daughter of a noble but not necessarily royal family. By the end of his 4th year, like his father, Akhenaten had built prolifically around the site of Karnak. But in both a radical departure from tradition and a slight to the god Amun, the massive complex he built was not only larger than Amun's main temple at Karnak, it was also dedicated to another god, the god Aten. On an inscription which was found in Amun's temple, Akhenaten is recorded as giving a speech to his court where he explains to them the falseness of all gods but the Aten. The footprint of the Aten complex that you see here is actually only one court of this entire structure. We know from inscriptions that he likely had at least 3 additional courts as well as this one, so it was a massive structure that he erected very, very quickly. And sadly, their archaeological traces have been lost. In this new complex, the god Aten, who had traditionally been represented as a hawk-headed man with a sun disk crown, had been given a new image as well as a new home. The god's image was abstracted to a hovering sun disk with rays of light streaming from it. Each ray of light ended in a hand which upheld Akhenaten and his wife. Although at first glance this appears to be a personal and attentive god, the hands of the Aten only extended to a very short list of items and people. Neither the children of Akhenaten and Nefertiti nor the common people are blessed with this direct attention. However, the Aten's rays do extend to his own temples and his offerings, as well as scenes of natural beauty. The changes Akhenaten wrought did not stop with this new temple and a new image for a reconceived god. He created a new belief system, one that negated almost all of the traditions of his people, including their time-honored burial practices. Using the main mode of propaganda available to him, Akhenaten used the iconography developed over thousands of years to explain and communicate these changes. For example, he borrowed from representations of fertility figures like the now god Hapi, who is shown with a pendulous stomach and breast. Akhenaten reappropriated this fertility-associated imagery as a means to communicate the changes and the fertility and abundance brought about by a belief in the Aten. He represented himself and Nefertiti as overweight, with bowed backs and spindly limbs. And to further emphasize the exceptional status of himself and his family, Akhenaten exaggerated his natural features. The elongation of his face, the pitted cheeks, and the slackness of his musculature was likely shocking to his audience in a manner that was perhaps intentional. He wanted for them to pay attention. He wanted for them to notice. He may have also even wanted for them to be shocked. By this time, Amenhotep IV, whose name meant, again, Amun is satisfied, had changed his name to Akhenaten, one who is effective for the Aten, indicating by his name what the king felt was his true mission, to act on behalf of the Aten. He also began an eradication program directed at the worship of Amun. The names and images of Amun and many other traditional gods were hacked away in hundreds of temples all over Egypt. For example, on this block, the central figure of the god Amun has been partially hacked out. Gods that were associated with the sun god Re, however, were pretty safe from this destruction, including, for example, Re's daughter Hathor. Around the 4th or 5th year of his reign, Akhenaten decided to move north, away from the southern city of Luxor, indicated here by the orange star, to establish a royal city entirely devoted to the Aten in the virgin desert at Tel El Amarna in Middle Egypt. Even today, this is an arid place. His huge new city was erected very quickly and had several features that were not found in other ancient Egyptian sites. The only temples were those dedicated either to the royal family or to the Aten, and were not roofed, but consisted of huge courtyards open to the sun. The tombs at Tel El Amarna were not permitted to show the traditional scenes of afterlife or the rituals of burial. Instead, they showed minimal scenes of the owner themselves and focused instead on scenes of the royal couple worshiping the Aten on their behalf. In the north here, we have the start of the Royal Road, which is the main road that formed the central artery of the city. It begins with the royal palaces that were sited in that area, each occupied by separate members of the royal family. The road continues in a straight line to pass the main temples as well as the main administrative palaces of the site. It ends at Komolnana, which I believe to be the site of the lost Sunshade of Re temple of Nefertiti. The modern site of the city, which Akhenaten called Akhetaten, or the horizon of the Aten, is a treasure for an archaeologist. Once the reigns of Akhenaten and Nefertiti concluded, the court almost immediately left the area. Only small pockets of people remained, and the rest of the city was abandoned. With no subsequent occupation layers placed on top of the Amarna period structures, this allowed the city to be remarkably well preserved. The walls of this house are a little bit over my head, and I recognize I'm short, but that's still pretty remarkable for an ancient city. The famous bust of Nefertiti was also found in the city of Tel El Amarna. And I'm going to now explore Nefertiti and her queenship a little bit further. The office of the Egyptian queen was traditionally concerned with assisting and supporting the divine kingship, both before and after the Amarna period. The depictions of Amenhotep III's queen Ti in the tomb of Kerawef demonstrate this, as there Ti is explicitly equated with Ma'at. Ma'at is both a goddess and a concept that governed the way the universe functioned. Without Ma'at, which was considered proper cosmic order and truth, creation itself would cease to exist. At Queen Ti's temple in a site called Sedinga in southern Egypt, she is also equated with Hathor, a goddess of sexuality and rebirth. These two examples again demonstrate the Egyptian tradition of equating the reigning queen with goddesses associated with the proper functioning, support, and regeneration of the universe. Queens, through their semi-divine magical fertility, are celebrated for their ability to offer rebirth to the king and the cosmos, thereby ensuring eternal life. Female goddesses were essential to the rebirth of the cosmos as well, which the Egyptians believed happened every day at dawn. The king traditionally represented the male aspects of this regeneration, while the queen represented the female aspects. However, the female creator goddesses had been rendered anathema by Atenism, by the changes wrought by Akhenaten. So a void remained in the cosmogony of the Aten religion. Traditional Egyptian religion had functioned by creating triads, pairing a male with a female god, who in turn create an offspring and therefore the universe. The only divine figure in the Amarna period was male or gender neutral. The traditional triad grouping was then recreated within the restrictions of Atenism to include Akhenaten and Nefertiti as the mythic offspring named Shu and Tefnut of the very first creator god. The king and queen thus served to fill a void left by their abandoning of the traditional pantheon. It appears not only Nefertiti, but her daughters as well were perhaps all used to satisfy the need for a female divine presence associated with sexual rejuvenation. Nefertiti was associated with the solar goddess Hathor as early as their stay in Luxor. Hathor is known as a goddess of sexuality, fertility, and rebirth. The fact that Nefertiti often wears Hathor's trademark crown, TM, in the Aten temple at Karnak, clearly associates her with this goddess and her abilities. Known as the Lady of Drunkenness, Hathor festivals held in Hathor's honor would have put to shame any American fraternity kegger. And Hathor's sexual attributes are very often celebrated in many myths, including one where she actually flashes her pubic region to her father Re in order to shock him out of a depression. It worked. The adoption of this crown by Nefertiti establishes Nefertiti's status as a sex goddess in her own right, able to manifest the regenerative power of sexual rejuvenation herself. Although it was damaged in antiquity, the reconstruction here of Akhenaten's sarcophagus further demonstrates the role Nefertiti played in relationship to her husband. The sarcophagus is embraced on all four sides by figures of Nefertiti, who is highlighted here in the light blue rectangles. Her image replaces the more traditional Isis, the goddess who normally embraces royal sarcophagi to grant resurrection to the king. This is a reference to one of the best-known myths of ancient Egypt. After Osiris, the proper king of Egypt, is dismembered by his jealous brother Seth, Isis, with her magic, puts Osiris back together and gives him the ability, quote unquote, to have sexual intercourse with her one last time. She conceives a son to inherit his throne, thereby assuring the proper continuance of Ma'at, or proper order in creation. Isis's abilities to revive and create life are the reason she embraces sarcophagi. She is invoked there as a means to achieve rebirth. She is the medium through which the king is rejuvenated and reborn in the afterlife. By replacing Isis with Nefertiti on this sarcophagus, she is explicitly equated with these sexual abilities and magical capacity, a sexual goddess of cosmogony and renewal in her own right. So Nefertiti is explicitly equated with both Isis as well as Hathor, two goddesses whose sexual capacities grant resurrection and renewal to the king. These abilities are likely the forces being invoked and celebrated in Nefertiti's Lost Sun Temple complex, which is to be more properly termed, after its ancient Egyptian title, a Sunshade of Re temple. This is the subject to which I will now turn. A Sunshade of Re temple, which can also be called a sun temple, is a cultic locale particular to the New Kingdom. It was traditionally dedicated to the solar god. It encompasses rituals dedicated to the cosmogonic renewal of the world, associated with the solar cycle. The term sunshade refers not to actual shade, but rather indicates the actions carried out in it are under the overarching attention of the sun. The title Sunshade of Re can be applied to a variety of buildings, from structures that range in size from a small chapel within the temple of another god, which is what you see here, or it can be applied to a large freestanding temple complex of its own. This last type is what we will be discussing primarily today, but smaller chapels within other temples certainly existed at Amarna as well. Due to its solar associations, sunshades of Re were popular, to say the least, at Tel el Amarna, the capital city of Akhenaten, where a sunshade was frequently an entire complex dedicated to the Aten, who is, again, the visible form of the sun god Re. We know through inscriptions that Akhenaten had given all female members of the royal family their very own sunshade, and only 2 of them, sadly, have been found archaeologically. Akhenaten therefore considered royal women to be the proper custodians of Sunshade of Re temples, which had not been the case previously. Our primary evidence for the traditional objective of a Sunshade of Re temple derives from the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, the father of Akhenaten, from an inscription within it detailing a sunshade chapel that was within this temple. On that stela, it's made clear that the sunshade temple was a locus for making offerings to the sun god in its form as a creator god, in, again, the cosmogonal sense. When the sun sets every night, it is in the manifestation of the aging form of the sun god, who travels through the dangerous underworld to emerge reborn in the morning as the child sun. Through this rebirth, all of existence is also reborn again every day. The safeguarding of this rebirth was considered essential to the well-being of the land of Egypt. The safeguarding of the sun god, simplified in Akhenaten's reign to the sun disk Aten, would have been a very high priority to Akhenaten, who also considered the sun god to be the primary creator of the world. However, as this is Akhenaten, he needed to place his own interpretation upon these shrines. The sunshade's association with rebirth and renewal dovetailed neatly into his use of Nefertiti and his daughters as representatives of the female divine generative presence needed by his cult. So he just simply combined the two. The sunshade temple of Nefertiti invoked her capacity as a creator goddess to safeguard, or perhaps even bring about, the rebirth of the sun every day. This is not without precedent in Egyptian religion. Royal women could act as priestesses to Amun in an office called the God's Wife of Amun. Another title for this station was the God's Hand. This second title is a more explicit reference to the actual duties performed by the God's Wife of Amun, as it refers to the myth that the first creator god masturbated in order to create the seed of existence that became the universe. The duty of the God's Wife of Amun, as the God's Wife of Amun, is to inspire the god sexually to ensure this act of creation. This is a reconstruction, which again the MFA people will know very well, of the Princess Meritaten's Sunshade Temple complex. Before Komolnana, it was the only excavated Sunshade of Re temple that we had from Tel el-Amarna. Note also, I should say, that Meritaten inherited the structure from Akhenaten's minor wife named Kia, who disappears from the historical record approximately year 16. In this reconstruction, you can see the size of the man-made lakes and pools and the extensive garden that was part of this Sun Temple complex. We also have evidence for extensive gardens and pools at Komolnana as well. We'll be turning to that in more detail in a little bit. However, as both sites are situated on a desert plain, the maintenance of the standing water in these man-made lakes and pools and the maintenance of the gardens would have required an enormous outlay of capital and effort. Despite the fact that a well was located nearby, the labor to maintain the site would have been quite prodigious. The appearance of these structures as fertile areas must therefore have been of paramount importance. According to Egyptian myths, when the world was very first created, it was a watery, chaotic space, and out of that water sprang vegetation and forms of life. This temple is then a physical manifestation, or a portrait, if you will, of that very first moment of creation. These items all suggest that the sun temples at Tel el-Amarna of both Nefertiti and all of her daughters were dedicated to those aspects of the queen that were associated with these regenerative aspects of queenship. Up until now, I've discussed the role of Nefertiti in Akhenaten's new belief system and the identity of sunshade temples in general as a means to explain the original function of those structures, which were so significant to the Amarna period. I will now review my contention that the site called Komolnana can be identified as the sunshade temple of Nefertiti. Komolnana, I should remind people, is the Arabic title which the locals have given to this area. We will be discussing these items in association with the only other excavated sunshade temple complex, the sunshade, which the Egyptians called the Maruwatan. So that's the ancient Egyptian title, the Maruwatan. Komolnana is Arabic, Maruwatan is ancient Egyptian. We just saw a reconstruction of this above. Originally dedicated to Akhenaten's secondary wife, Kia, the site also had queenly associations, so we can combine the two. This is a view of the site of Komolnana from Google Earth. These green lines outline the outer walls of the complex. It was originally approximately the size of 5 football fields. The site was partially excavated in the 1980s and 1990s by Barry Kemp, but due to budget constraints, the material from the excavation had not been subjected to an in-depth post-excavation analysis. So I'm going to now continue by orienting you to the site itself, and then I will review the inscriptional, art historical, and archaeological evidence that I used to demonstrate the site as the Sunshade of Re Temple of Nefertiti. I have here a schematic map of Komolnana, courtesy of Barry Kemp. Excavations revealed that there was a mud brick buttressed wall with 4 entrance gateways or pylons. 2 of those pylons were in the western wall, 1 was in the eastern wall, and a fourth in the southern wall. There was an internal wall found in these three locations, which ran east-west between two gates in the western wall, creating two separate areas within the enclosure. The buildings within the southern half are better preserved than those in the north. We have much more evidence for them. They were set back off the north-south axis of the space, resting in the eastern half of the area, which is kind of intriguing. I get into that issue in a different lecture. A row of small houses was excavated in the southeast corner. The elevated central platform has been called the central platform. To the north and south of this platform, there are two large buildings respectively called the South Shrine and the South Pavilion. The northern enclosure, however, is much less understood because settlements dating to the Coptic and Roman eras had been established on top of the central Amarna period structures. According to the excavations that were done on the site, the size of the tops of the walls uncovered in 1993 showed that it was originally a very large-scale mud brick building, but sadly the original ground plan is currently unknown. I'm working with Jillian Pike to figure out a way for us to excavate this without destroying each other's material. Copticists and Egyptologists working together, it sometimes doesn't work well. In addition to this, which is very significant, a large-scale industrial baking and brewing area was discovered in the northeastern corner of the enclosure. This region here was also found to be dense with a particular kind of bread mold, and that's an important subject that we're going to return to later on. There was a second stone structure found directly opposite the dividing wall from the south shrine and the southern enclosure. Since this was in the north enclosure, it's been originally called the North Shrine. So we have the North Shrine and the South Shrine. Like the South Shrine, it is on the east-west axis and was probably aligned with the northwest pylon entrance in the western enclosure wall. Unlike the rest of the mud brick complex, the North and South Shrines were constructed of stone, and extensive fragments of that decoration was uncovered, and that's another aspect that I will get to as well. There were several garden plots that were found as well, located in these regions. It's more extensive likely than this, but that's how much we've been able to excavate. So I'm going to now discuss the inscriptional evidence for identifying Komolnana as the sunshade of Re of Nefertiti. This fragment, which is also again from Komolnana, retains part of a royal head and a fragmentary inscription. The long upright of the fan for the Egyptologist is preserved in the right column, which is over the sun hieroglyph in a logographic stroke, hence shoot Re. I can't believe that Peter de Manuelian is seeing my appalling drawings of this thing. I could melt in shame. On sandstone fragment 2640, poor craftsmanship and preservation cause the epigraphy to be enigmatic until it's examined in raking light, in which case we can also see clearly the words shoot Re or sunshade of Re. There is no doubt then that Komolnana is indeed a sunshade of Re temple. However, as is very often the case with fragmentary inscriptions, I have hundreds and hundreds of fragments of Nefertiti's name and hundreds of her title, but none that are directly associated with the title sunshade of Re. That's archaeology. So we have to turn to other avenues in order to clarify the original owner of the site. So I'm going to take you through, missing the smoking gun, I will take you through my reasoning process to identify the structure. The first block, which you can see here, you outlined in the red outline here, you can see the forehead of a royal person wearing the uraeus snake, the serpent sign of the royal person. The first item to investigate will be this serpent at the brow. Eaton Krause and I have both found that at Amarna, Nefertiti wears the single uraeus and no other female member of the royal family, including Akhenaten's minor Queen Tia, Kia, and his mother, Queen Ti, share this feature. This is unlike the earlier representations at Karnak, where Nefertiti can be shown with a double uraeus, so her iconography actually changes when she goes to Amarna, which is kind of interesting. These two heads of Amenhotep III's Queen Ti are not from Tel el Amarna, but they demonstrate what I'm trying to get at, which is that she wears more elaborate crowns with double uraei that were an aspect of her iconography. The wooden head of Tia from the Berlin Ägyptische Museum on the left has two holes where her uraei would have been inserted, while the granite head of Ti from the Cairo Museum on the right demonstrates these uraei still intact. And again, for the Egyptologists in the audience, Tia is represented with 2 uraei and Nefertiti with 1 when they're shown together in the tomb of Huya at Tel el Amarna as well. So they're even juxtaposed directly with this iconography. Kia, Akhenaten's secondary wife, is also not given this single uraeus, and nor are his daughters. The secondary wife, Kia, for reasons we don't understand completely, she disappears from the historical record around Akhenaten's regnal year 16. As you can see on this block, her inscriptions and images were destroyed or modified after she disappeared. In many cases, they are reworked to represent the Princess Meritaten, which is what happened with this block. Kia is, to the best of my knowledge, again represented with a single uraeus. And in addition, we already know where her sunshade was, because it's the only other excavated sunshade structure at Komolnana. So she can't be the owner of Komolnana. The second item to investigate in this royal figure is the hairstyle, what we call the Nubian wig. For example, you can see a fragment of Nefertiti with the same iconography on this fragment, which is currently in the Berkeley Museum on the left. The so-called Nubian wig was especially popular in the Amarna period, which is characterized by these long pointed lappets that brush the collarbones. Many women in this time period wore this wig. It was very trendy, including Kia herself. The wig indeed became so popular that men, as well as women of all ranks, began to wear this wig. On occasion, Akhenaten wears this type of wig himself. It's not frequent, but he does wear it. The distinguishing feature here in this image is that the wig is joined by a single uraeus. Due to the single uraeus, we can cross out the Queen Mother T and Akhenaten's minor wife, Kia, as well as the princesses, who never wear the uraei. It follows that this can only be identified as either Akhenaten or Nefertiti, as they are the only ones who wear a combination of the Nubian wig with a single uraeus snake. If we study the few representations that preserve images of the royal family in proximity to a sunshade of right title, i.e. inscription, we can further reinforce this conclusion that this must either be Akhenaten or Nefertiti. In this image, Akhenaten leads his mother Ti to her sunshade temple at Amarna. We haven't yet found this temple archaeologically, but you can see that Ti follows immediately after Akhenaten, with no image of Nefertiti in the scene at all. The title of the sunshade itself is highlighted in the red box here. From the princesses, formerly Kia's, sunshade of Re temple, comes this inscription on a balustrade from the site. These columns here preserve the complete title of the sunshade of Re, and this is an image of Akhenaten, followed directly by his daughter Meritaten, as they offer to the Aten within her sunshade temple. Again, the owner of the site is directly behind Akhenaten, close to the title of the sunshade, and the queen is not present. The proximity of this figure to the title, Sunshade of Re, indicates this must either be a figure of Akhenaten or the owner of the site, which we have seen due to its iconography can only be him or Nefertiti. The archaeological context of this site narrows this deduction further, and I believe demonstrates that the site is that of Nefertiti. So we're going to turn to that now, including those bread molds that I was so excited about initially. I know that archaeologists get very excited about these things, and other people want to take a nap. The pottery bread molds that were found in the industrial baking area of the north enclosure, which we discussed before, provided essential evidence for the analysis of the site. In the form of a cone, they produced the distinctive bread loaves associated in the New Kingdom with festivals and special events. Only 2 other areas at Amarna, the Great and Small Aten temples, had both concentrations of these molds, as well as large-scale industrial baking areas. Kemp and I believe that this indicates Komolnana had the same preeminence in the city as those 2 structures, and that the area can be associated, therefore, with the very first building plans of Akhetaten. Komolnana's location in the city is also an indicator of the status of the site. It is aligned directly on the original pathway of the royal road as it was very first conceived. As time went on, it deviated in the southern suburb to follow the natural contours of the riverbank. It is therefore, since Komolnana is on the original pathway, and the pathway does not alter, it is therefore likely to have been part of the very first wave of construction. As one of the earliest buildings on the Amarna Plain, it's also possible to suggest that the site is associated with an inscription detailing the founding of the city on the boundary stela. On these inscriptions, Akhenaten indicates several buildings were to be constructed first at Akhenaten. I included the transliteration of the thing for the Egyptologists in the audience in case you all want to get grammatically nerdy. The first two buildings in this inscription, the House of the Aten and the Mansion of the Aten, have long been identified as the Great and Small Aten temples in the central city. However, the third, called the Sunshade of Re and dedicated to the royal wife, Nefertiti, have been considered lost to the archaeological record. So to summarize the points that I've just made, according to the boundary stela, 3 buildings were to be constructed first at Amarna: the house and mansion of the Aten and the Sunshade of Re temple of Nefertiti. And only 3 sites at Amarna were provided with industrial food production areas, and only 3 sites have evidence of conical bread molds. Further, 3 of the largest sites at Tel El Amarna are on the original pathway of the royal road in the central city. The first and second of all of these are the House of the Aten and the Mansion of the Aten, called by the excavators again the Great and Small Aten temples, and Komolnana is the third. Komolnana, therefore, could be the third building mentioned in the proclamation on the boundary stela, and therefore the Sunshade of Nefertiti. In summary of the points I've covered up to this point, you're not done yet. We have reviewed Amarna queenship and the role Nefertiti played as a cosmogonal goddess in relationship to the Aten cult. We have discussed Sunshade of Re temples, establishing their role in the Amarna belief system as a means to ensure cosmogonal renewal by invoking the sexual abilities of Nefertiti as a divine progenitor to protect the rebirth of the sun god, celebrated in his form as a creator god. We have also reviewed the evidence that supports the identity of Komolnana as a Sunshade of Re temple, and also reviewed the evidence that indicates it was in all probability owned by Nefertiti. I will now place these discoveries in context of the other aspect of my analysis of the site of Komolnana, which is the reconstruction of the decoration of those stone shrines that we had talked about. With the importance placed on Nefertiti and her role in Akhenaten's reign, one would assume that even if this is not her temple, that the art in this temple would celebrate her status and emphasize her importance as well, you would think. As I said in the orientation to the site, to Komolnana, there are 2 areas that were built out of stone, the north and south shrines. Like every stone structure at Amarna, Akhenaten's successors quarried this stone for reuse in other buildings. So although the original walls are gone, thousands of fragments of stone chippings were discovered at the site. By studying these fragments and their find spots carefully, it became clear very early on to me that they were actually the detritus left behind by the demolition crews, which were organized in a very methodical and organized manner, with strikes of a hammer used to detach the stone blocks from their mortar. The stone chips that resulted from this fell at the feet of the quarrymen and remained very close to the original location on the wall until they were excavated by Barry Kemp. The stone scatter is within just about a meter of the original site of the wall as it runs down the trench. It's really quite remarkable. You can tell they just didn't travel at all. A large part of my work here at Harvard is finalizing the reconstructions of the artistic content of the scenes that I have been able to reconstruct. So I will now go through my method of how I reconstructed those scenes and then show you an example. Organizing these thousands of fragments into coherent scenes and formulating an understanding of the decoration was quite a challenge. Several different methods of approaching this problem were used, including ancient Egyptian canons of proportion and gridding, and the application of the cartouches of the Aten to the bodies of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. This was a particular honorific motif in the Amarna period. I've observed in my research that the arrangement of these cartouches in relationship to the body is very consistent. When the motif appears, the cartouches are always represented right side up and face the same direction as the figure wearing them. They occasionally deviate from that, but it's extremely, extremely rare. No matter the body's position, they are always oriented so that the viewer can read them. This is this represents actually a good example of these restrictions, which is a fragment of a balustrade currently in the Cairo Museum. I've highlighted the outlines of the cartouches in order to make them clearer. On Akhenaten's chest, you can see 3 pairs of these cartouches are shown with the horizontal element, that's the bottom of the cartouche, or orthogonal to the ground. And on the proper left arm, the cartouches are again identically oriented. The other arm, however, is reaching towards the viewer's left, towards the Aten disc, which is hovering overhead. On the bicep, the cartouches follow the line of the arm, again with the crossbar, the lower horizontal element, facing towards the ground. However, on the lower half of the reaching arm, which bends upward at the elbow, although the cartouche follows the line of the arm, the crossbar is still placed toward the ground, so the hieroglyphs remain right side up to the viewer, otherwise it'd be upside down. So these cartouches appear to have been oriented to the viewer first and to the body second. It should also be noted these body cartouches, I've called them body cartouches, it's graceless, but there you are. They only appear on Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and they only appear on their arms and their torsos, never anywhere else. So this allows my work to sift through the identity of various different people as they're, and also gives you an idea of the identification and orientation of these figures' bodies in space. So I just need to have a tiny little bit of a cartouche, and I can tell quite a bit. Since it's very rare to have exact matches from this site, another problem facing this task is of scale and proportion rather than the matching of breakage points. According to the great work by Gay Robbins on Egyptian canons of measurement, a grid system using 20 horizontal lines was used in the Amarna period to draw royal figures. A few small fragments of limestone and painted plaster from Komolnana preserve these red grid lines, so we're sure they used that technique there. So it's possible, using the better preserved figural fragments, to estimate the size of the squares used for each royal figure. And that includes will allow you to include or exclude objects that would otherwise appear proportional to the naked eye, which is a significant element of this research. So now there's going to be math. There's going to be math. So, hold on. Stick with me. I'm going to use a particular example here. I'm going to use 2 examples, actually, to demonstrate how I drew a particular figure. This particular fragment here, 15 by 17 centimeters, you can see part of a limb with a pleated garment next to it. The only representation that matches that fragment with the limb and those pleats is the area between the legs of a striding figure of the king wearing the royal kilt. These pleats appear to represent the underneath of the far side of the kilt. The section of the leg preserved has no clear sculptural details. There's no kneecap. There's no other elements that indicate that there's a particular kind of anatomy preserved, which actually helps us also determine where this comes from. It can't be from the lower leg, because pleats at this angle on that fragment just only occur from the knee up, so it has to be from the upper leg. So this section of leg must be behind or above the knee, where the thighs lack any kind of sculptural detail in this way. These 3 different examples of these grids illustrate that this section of the king's body lies between horizontal lines 4 and 6. This area takes 2 squares in each representation of the king. These 2 squares cover the area between the hem of the kilt and the inner area of the striding leg. In each of these examples, the lower square between horizontals 4 and 5 has only the lower edges of the pleats. Therefore, this fragment must be located between 5 and 6. This is what I do. Okay, this is my life. You think you're bored now. Try doing this 7,000 times. So based on these observations, this fragment has to come from a striding proper left leg, which would face to the right, which is approximately, therefore, the size of 1 grid square. This can be used to determine the general proportions of this figure. So 1 square would measure approximately 15 or 16 centimeters, with the whole figure measuring approximately 300 to 320 centimeters, plus or minus a few centimeters, wearing a pleated long royal kilt, again, facing to the right. So in association with that, again, stick with me, this next fragment. Measuring 24 by 18.5, we have Akhenaten's lower arm preserved. The fact that this is royal is indicated by the color of the paint as well as the body cartouches that are indicated clearly on the arm. The cartouches contain, again, the earliest form of the Aten name. I finally have one example of the late form of the Aten name. And we also can see a curve of the king's belly that is preserved. The belly itself is broken off, but the sunken relief edge is preserved with red and the line of white that would have indicated the kilt. The lower arm of the king, as was preserved on that fragment, appears to generally take approximately 2 squares of the grid. This arm segment, when compared with other representations of the king, is about 1.5 squares. So the measurement of the squares for the figure on that last fragment would be 300 to 320 centimeters, the same proportions indicated by the first fragment that we looked at, which means those two are from the very same large-scale, right-facing figure wearing a long pleated royal kilt. This is an image of Akhenaten, and this is my life. This is what I do. So using this method, I've been able to create 20 reconstructions of royal scenes, including architectural elements and other genres of decoration that I've been able to represent. I looked at thousands of fragments from the excavation. The picture that you see here is actually are fragments. This is only part of the fragments from one excavation square. So one of the most surprising elements that I discovered when I began to place these fragments together on paper was the appearance of the queen. I expected that images like this of her actually smiting the heads of the enemies of Egypt, an act usually reserved for the king, would have been present in the sunshade. Also, she's shown in the tombs at Amarna at a natural height to Akhenaten. She's shorter, but not in a dramatic fashion. She's naturally shorter, but not remarkably so. However, this is far more representative of the royal scenes with Nefertiti at Komolnana. She is almost less than half the height of the king. You can barely even see her. In Egyptian art, size matters, right? The larger you are in a scene, the more significance and power you are accorded. Her diminutive size in most of these reconstructions seem to de-emphasize her importance and emphasize her subordination to Akhenaten. But it's important to place this image in context with other images of Nefertiti, images that have not been factored into the popular imagination regarding Nefertiti. Nefertiti is popularly imagined to be a powerful, independent queen with a great deal of agency.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes, of course.
How do you know that's Nefertiti and not one of the children or something like that?
Oh, good question. You can see there are actually, no, not at all. That's a very excellent question. Down at the bottom, I will point. That's one of the few matches that I have, actually. I had a little happy dance. I actually had a little happy dance when I found that fragment. So it's very clear that she is directly behind the king, and there's no doubt that that's Akhenaten. So it's definitely her. Very, very good question, though. Thank you. So again, Nefertiti is very often accorded this unique status in the reign of Akhenaten. However, in the primary administrative centers of the central city, this unnatural height difference is quite frequent. On this fragment of granite balustrade from the central city, Nefertiti is represented as equally diminutive. She follows Akhenaten closely, who looms over her to a great height. It's possible that Nefertiti's iconography was manipulated by the king. According to an inscription of one of his sculptors named Bach, Akhenaten had direct control over the royal artisans. There is no evidence to suggest that Nefertiti had similar influence over any of the art. Nefertiti's status, as conveyed by her iconography, may have been emphasized or de-emphasized according to Akhenaten's cultic or political needs. As such, although Nefertiti has had a reputation as being a uniquely strong queen, that impression should be nuanced with the understanding that she was presented as powerful and strong when Akhenaten wanted her to be so. Can't help it. Although Nefertiti played a significant role in the religion of Akhenaten and is often represented as a powerful and independent figure, we should not be so quick to assume those representations were a reflection of reality. It is tempting to place feministic and anachronistic interpretation onto the evidence. After all, we want to see Nefertiti as equal to Akhenaten in his cult and his court. But the complete evidence from Nefertiti, from Tel el-Amarna demands that we take a much more nuanced view. Thank you very much for your attention.